need to be able to hear you, and I'm sure Jeff would like to hear you, so use your most theatrical voice that you can, especially those of you in the back. So, Jennifer, do you want to start?
Oh.
This is a theater arts class, right?
That's right. No, we're not online.
Oh, we aren't? Okay. Sorry, I just rode my bike here.
It's great.
My name is Jennifer. I'm a faculty member in Urban Studies and Planning. And about 3 years ago,
Maybe even 4.
4 years ago, Jeff came to interview me about bike stuff and said he was taking a year off to write this book. And here it is. And in case you missed it, did you mention that?
Not yet.
Are you going to?
New York Times?
Yeah.
I will.
Okay. I'll show it.
So,
I'm Don Deerhood, retired interested citizen.
My name is Cecilia Kopp, and I'm applying to the MERC program for transportation in fall 2010. Avid cyclist, studying some bike tours, and just interested in this stuff. So,
great.
yeah.
My name is Richard Moretz. I'm with Don, just for the interested citizen.
Very good.
Ali Zahir, civil engineering undergrad.
Rick Reynolds. I'm a former teacher and curriculum developer, and I'm working on a sustainability curriculum for K-12 education, and wondering if I might pick up on a day or two for that.
Great. Cooper Morrow, another citizen.
Ian Studi, I'm the transportation options manager for the state.
Ryan Gratzer, program administrator, Center for Transportation Studies.
Kyle Helen, employee housing.
Chip Label, just for general knowledge.
Scott Fletcher, graduate student, computer science and GIS.
David Ralph, I'm a first year MERC student.
I'm Melissa Bergman, and I'm also a first-year MERC student. I'm Kate McClellan, and I'm also a first-year MERC student. Tavares Rivera, undergrad civil engineering. I'm Tammy Garcia, graduate student at UC.
Wei Feng, civil engineering graduate.
Kevin White, Oregon fellow.
Bob Trillett, graduate student.
Todd Johnson, first year civil engineering. Ryan Conrad, first year civil engineering.
I'm Ian Silvering, first year master student in civil.
Alex Biazzi, civil engineering undergrad for 1 more week.
You can take a nap. That's fine.
My name is Tara Sullivan. I am a student to be first year of MERC student. I work with 1,000 Friends of Oregon.
Richard Ross, I'm a transportation planner and a MERC alumni.
Sadie Kearney, and I'm soon to be a MERC student as well. We should mold you undergrad.
Very good. So we're going to go online in just a second. I'm going to wave at the crew in the back. Here we go. So welcome to the PSU Friday Transportation Seminar. It's our last official seminar of the spring term, although we have several more scheduled between now and the fall. This is the last official class seminar. And I'm very pleased to welcome Jeff Mapes to Portland State to talk about his book, Pedaling Revolution. I'm on page 234 of the book. I was on a plane last night and I just couldn't make it till the end, but I expect later today that I'll complete it, and I really enjoyed reading it, and I've learned a lot about the history of cycling around the country and around the world. I should mention that, like Jennifer, I'm a bike commuter, and at least half of the transportation faculty here at PSU commute regularly by bike, so 5 out of 10. We're hoping to have an 11th faculty member join us in the fall, and we need to make sure that that new faculty member gets us over 50%. So with no further ado, I'll introduce Jeff and look forward to his presentation.
Hi, thanks very much. You know, this is really amazing hearing that half the faculty here bikes. It reminds me of a great profile I read in the New Yorker a couple years ago about theoretical physicists. And there's sort of 2 types of physicists. You know, there's the ones that need lots and lots of money to build superconducting super colliders. You know, you guys are familiar with those. And then there's the kind of theoretical physicists who deal in string theory, and schools love them because, as the New Yorker describes it, the only thing they need is a chalkboard and a place to park their bikes. So you have a long pedigree of academics riding their bikes to their work. In fact, I think Jennifer maybe should start on a study is why the mode share is so high among professors. What is it about that particular classification? It's kind of a fascinating thing. One of many research topics that should be done. Thanks again so much for the very kind introduction. And it was so nice of you to put the book up there. Of course, I thought I had to do it up on the screen. One thing I found about when you do write a book is you just have to be shameless in promoting the thing. So I apologize for being that. I'm usually not this way, but you know, that's what the marketplace does to you. Let's see how this is going to work. There we go. At any rate, I don't have a lot of photos, but I couldn't resist bringing this one that my wife, a loyal comics reader, pointed out to me this morning, or actually a couple days ago. And I swear to God, I don't know the cartoonist, my friend Jeff. That is not me. I don't wear spandex very often. And I don't think that I'm all, you know, self-righteous. But, you know, I think there is actually a little bit of truth to that. You know, it sort of reminds me of when I go up to Timberline or something, and there's just something about the way the really hardcore skiers kind of walk, you know. They kind of have that something in their legs. Maybe it's because they're wearing those clunky boots. But, you know, you almost just want to go, God, these people are so arrogant. And I wonder, you know, if a lot of the world is sort of viewing cyclists that way, which, I mean, and actually, believe it or not, I do have a point about that, because one thing that I did discover in writing this book, and this is, to me, kind of a fascinating thing, is that there's something about cyclists that really makes them very passionate about what they do, and they really have had kind of an outsized impact on the transportation system. As this whole urban bike movement has kind of developed, it's almost the story of an individual who's gotten involved in bicycling, sort of sees what a great transportation tool it is at the urban level, and then kind of making a difference. I'll give you a couple examples. One is, frankly, the most powerful, think about this, the most powerful person in Congress right now on transportation issues is Jim Oberstar. Sorry, Earl Blumenauer, Congressman from Portland, it's not you. It's Jim Oberstar, who is now the chairman of the House Transportation Committee. And, you know, he was just kind of a normal congressman. You know, he was very much involved in transportation issues, kind of an old-fashioned New Dealer. He believes in tax and spend, and, you know, and still kind of remains to this day very supportive of putting more money into rails, into highways, into ports, into airports. I mean, he loves infrastructure. In the 1980s, he kind of took up cycling. In part, his first wife had cancer, and it was one form of exercise that she could do, and so they would cycle together. And then when she got worse, he would go on rides on his own to sort of get in a better frame of mind, try to help himself a little bit. It was a very sad and poignant story. She ended up dying. But out of this came this real passion for cycling that Oberstar developed. And when he, through the seniority system, began climbing into power in Congress, he became he helped cyclists along. He helped just in the last transportation bill get $600 million in to start a Safe Routes to School program. Many of you may be familiar with that, where they're trying to teach kids at the elementary level, encourage them and provide the tools for them to be able to walk and bicycle to school, to try to reverse this big change we've had, where over the last 30 or 40 years we've gone from a society where most kids did walk or bicycle or maybe take a school bus to school, where frankly most are driven to school nowadays. He also provided, you know, through his clout, $100 million to establish these pilot programs in 4 communities to see if they could boost mode share for bicycling. They're talking in the next transportation bill, you know, maybe extending that to 40 or 50 communities. And that's just a few of the things that he's been involved in. And once again, this was not anything that some big powerful interest group came to him, or that he saw as, hey, this is the way I'm going to get reelected from, the Iron Range of Minnesota. If any of you are aware of northern Minnesota, this is not exactly, the big issue that's going to make or break him electorally. But it's just one example of really how important just sort of important a role that individuals have played in this whole bike movement that has developed over several years. And you think about it, in many ways in this country we've actually had sort of a top-down system. Certainly, after World War II, Americans very much took to the automobile. I mean, it was there's no doubt it provided a great deal of mobility and all of that. But once again, it was lubricated by massive amounts of money at the federal, state, and local level. We started really almost an unprecedented public works program, something that this country really never did before in terms of developing the interstate system. Very much the transit systems that we're starting to see come back at the local level now. Those are very much developed. Once again, I would argue sort of in a top-down way, kind of the elites, business, whether it was business or local community leaders really seeing the need for this. And yes, to some degree, having public support for it, but in many ways, like I say, from a top-down. And what's been fascinating to me is to see sort of this bottom-up thing happen, that really nobody rides a bike unless it's something that they enjoy doing and they get kind of passionate about. They've been able to then make an impact that I think in many ways almost is beyond the numbers that they've had in many communities. In fact, one thing that I think would be an interesting, I'm going to ramble on a little bit, but as I go along, I'm going to throw out various research topics that maybe you guys could help me on my next book. But one thing that I think would be fascinating to see is what percentage of trips reasonably could be made by bike. This is one of the many topics, at least I never really ran across any information on that gave me a sense of that. And I think it'd be kind of fascinating to figure that out, because as this whole movement has developed, there's not really, I don't think anybody really has a good sense of, okay, what is it that we're talking about? In Portland, where we've certainly been the most successful large city that has moved into cycling. The Census Bureau shows somewhere around 4.5%. I believe that's the American Community Survey, actually, the one that they do every year, has shown around 4.5% of Portlanders commute by bicycle. There's some issues about whether that's accurate. The Portland City Auditor says that 8% identify bicycling as their main form of commuting. So, and once again, maybe there's some questions about that. That survey is taken in August, but somewhere around in there is certainly an impressive number, particularly given one time I kind of figured out that the amount of money that we've spent on Portland's bike infrastructure is less than the amount we spent to kind of completely redo the Sylvan intersection on Highway 26. If any of you are aware of that particular intersection, it was really less than $100 million, and that's really even if you take a very sort of liberal accounting of everything. For example, if you assign all of the cost of the East Side Esplanade to the bike network, and I think you can make a strong argument that there's a lot more going on the East Side Esplanade than just a route for bicycling, in terms of pedestrian and recreational use, what it does kind of for the livability of the East Side and redevelopment over there, and that sort of thing. I wanted to also talk a little bit, so how this sort of all developed, sort of the growth of this movement, and that was one thing that was sort of fascinating to me. I went back and talked to a lot of people who'd been involved in it for a long time, and it really almost for so many years moved under the radar screen that people didn't notice. But I think it's worth recounting a little bit of it. And so this is sort of my abbreviated history of the urban bike movement in this country. And I go back, where I really start is in the early 1970s. And a funny thing happened to the bike industry then is all of a sudden their sales just started spiking up. I mean, it was just wild. All of a sudden dealers couldn't keep bikes, in stock. They were being sold out quicker than possible. This was the first time when imported bikes started making a real dent in the U.S. market because people were sort of just desperate for supply anywhere, and it was very uncertain what was going on. There were some publications that were writing about that we were having all of a sudden this real transportation revolution. That this was a time of a lot of ferment in society. We'd gone through women's liberation, anti-war movement. Just a lot of ferment in society, and a lot of people were saying, well, this is it. This is kind of the counter-reaction to the real growth of the automobile movement, because cars really became ubiquitous after World War II, where essentially every American family came to own one. You started seeing bike advocacy groups that sprung up around the country. Some national groups formed. The federal government, for the first time, started putting a little bit of research money into it. And then almost as mysteriously as the boom started, it stopped. All of a sudden, they seemed to have saturated the movement or the market. They weren't, all of a sudden, dealers had a glut all of a sudden of bikes. And really, in looking back on it, what people have really been able to figure out was that really it was kind of the tail end of the baby boomer generation. It was my generation. I grew up I was born in 1954, really grew up in the 60s and the early 70s. And this actually happened to me. I was riding my little Stingray around as a kid, and I got a 10-speed bike and started riding all over the city. I had kind of a free-range childhood. We used to think it was fun to go over to Berkeley to watch the riots. I grew up in Oakland, California. So not exactly a sanctioned activity, but at any rate, what they've sort of been able to determine years later is that really we had this very strong youth culture of riding bikes. It's amazing if you go back and look at pictures of schools back in the 1950s and 60s, schoolyards filled with bikes and kids riding them, and you don't see that too much nowadays. And that generation, my generation, we were sort of moving up to 10 speeds and all that sort of thing. What happened, though, was we all got our 10 speeds, then we stopped buying bikes, and frankly, we kind of stopped riding once we reached early adulthood. And so it turned out not to be the transportation revolution that many of us thought it might be. Although what did really come out of that was it did create sort of an advocacy movement that never entirely went away, and it helped cement, I think, kind of at least a small group of advocates in kind of city after city who kind of kept the spark of this alive. Also, there was at least one city in America, I think a few other cities too, Davis, California, where during this period they really kind of built a city that was very friendly to bicycle. They had very high mode share because, in large part, because you had this large university right next to the city. The chancellor of the school, once again another one of these kind of individuals who just cared about that, banned cars from the UC Davis campus, and as a result you had a large group of people that this was by far the best and the easiest option was to get around by bike, and so Davis developed into this city with a lot of bikeways of all different kinds and things that frankly you hardly saw anywhere else. In my book I kind of likened it to this city a little bit in amber, preserved in amber, waiting for a later generation to look at what they were doing. And then you had things, during the 80s, when the Reagan administration came into office, they immediately knocked out all the federal contracts that went for the study of bicycling in any form, looking at it as any sort of use as transportation. We'd had gas shortages in the 70s and some price spikes. That, I also think, developed some interest in cycling as an alternative, and that all pretty much went away in the 80s. Gas became cheap again. The average mile driven by Americans, in cars, really exploded in the 80s and 90s. People moved further and further out. The whole term in real estate circles, drive till you qualify, really became part of the lexicon. And it just became a pretty unfriendly environment for cycling during those years. Fascinating thing happened then at the end of the 80s, start of the 90s, and we'd completed the interstate system by then, and people were sort of scratching around figuring, okay, what's kind of next? All the state departments of transportation, the highway builders, the automakers, sort of the whole complex of powerful economic interests that really cared about keeping federal money flowing for transportation, and particularly for automobile-based transportation. We're trying to figure out, okay, what's the federal role? At the same time, there was a whole coalition of a whole bunch of groups that really had been very much losers in this game for many years. The mayors of large cities who largely had been had no say over how federal highway dollars were spent. And in fact, what happened was oftentimes, these big freeways were rammed through cities and had a huge impact on the cities, and it wasn't necessarily, this was done more by the states, and a lot of times mayors didn't have much of a say in it, city officials, although some did cheer later on, I should say. But there were a lot of other groups, urban planning organizations, interestingly, the American Association of Architects, or whatever their trade group was very interested in it. There were some bike and pedestrian-oriented groups like Rails to Trails Conservancy, and they formed a group called the Surface Transportation Policy Project. In fact, they called themselves the Losers Coalition. That was sort of their informal in-house name, and they decided, well, let's kind of hijack this bill before anybody notices what's going to happen to it. The next transportation bill that's coming down the road, and they managed to get the ear of Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who many of you probably are unfamiliar with, but was a very famous senator from the time and really known for a lot of, for really being kind of a public intellectual who wrote in a wide variety of areas. Turned out when he was a young man in the late 50s, early 60s, he wrote about how the highway program was going to be a disaster for cities, and that when you have the federal government paying 90% of the cost of a highway project, you're going to get a lot of questionable projects if you don't really do much planning in cities for how you're going to handle them. And so a bunch of people who knew the senator really kind of went to him and said, look, you wrote about this many years ago. Now's your chance to start making a difference. Moynihan got interested in the subject. He was a key player on the Senate side, and lo and behold, they did manage to come up with a bill many of you might have heard of before, called ISTA, Interstate Transportation Efficiency Act. I think that's right. Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act, right, that's it. Passed in 1991, really provided the first major funding at the federal level for bicycling projects. So all of a sudden you had a flow of money coming on that never happened before. It required that each State Department of Transportation have a bicycle and pedestrian coordinator. So all of a sudden you had, so to speak, somebody inside the tent at least a little bit inside the tent. And the money that was starting to flow, it attracted the interest of the bike industry, which really had not been doing much lobbying. They started getting more involved. You started seeing more advocacy groups spring up, at least in part because they had something that they could go after. And once again, as I was saying earlier, because bicycling is really such a cheap form of transportation, they were, it doesn't take a huge flow of money to start making a difference out on the streets and to start seeing things that that start making a change. So that was sort of rolling along, and at the same time in the 90s you had the public health community that started to get interested in the whole subject of what came to be known as active transportation. And what really kind of led them to it was there had been a lot of efforts, gosh, going really all the way back to, I think, John F. Kennedy when he formed the Council on, President's Council on Physical Fitness. You know, this whole idea that we were kind of, you know, getting, what does he say up there? Fat, lazy, yeah, as a society. But, you know, there was a concern that, you know, we had to become more fit, and by the 90s, the public health community was really realizing that they had a whole obesity problem on their hands. I think, you know, in the late 80s, early 90s, something like 2 states had obesity rates over 20%. By the end of that decade, it was like there were only a couple states that were under 30%, or that were under 20%. They were much more headed up toward 30%. So, you know, they started realizing they had a problem in their hands, and started realizing, you know, that all their efforts to convince people to get more exercise as sort of a separate thing in and of it by itself was just simply not working. That most people, you know, they'd say they just didn't have time or the inclination to do that. And as a result, they started realizing that they needed to integrate it much more in people's lives, exercise that is, if they were going to make huge gains. I remember reading a Surgeon General's report, I want to say from about 95 or 96, that really, it sort of surprised me a bit, really talked quite a bit about bicycling and walking too, but that, you know, really made a point that we needed to do that a lot more as a society. And I think that's something that, you know, at least as I remember back in the mid-90s, I don't think the average person was talking a great deal about that. So that was another important development that happened. You sort of roll forward, and then we start, you know, after the turn of the century, I think climate change started to become an issue of wide public concern. You know, peak oil started entering the lexicon. Of course, you're all very familiar with that. We started seeing some real spikes up in gas prices. I think 2005 was, you know, one of the first really noticeable ones. Congestion had risen quite a bit. You know, that had become a kind of an annual feature every year when the Texas Transportation Institute put out their new figures on, you know, congestion in all the American cities, you know, and how many hours of delay people spent in traffic. And, you know, so all of these things I think were coming together to really increase a lot of interest in looking at alternatives. Certainly we started seeing a lot more interest in communities in developing transit options, you know, light rail, streetcars, bus rapid transit, all those types of things. And bikes were really right there as part of all that. And I think, you know, and here's where I want to talk a little bit about culture too, because I think that's really been an important part of it. Is part of a change that I think has really made a difference. You know, I was sort of maybe focusing a little bit on the infrastructure side, but I think culture part of it is very important too. I mean, we've seen a couple things happen. One is there's been a real revitalization of cities in America over the last 20, 30 years. You know, I'm old enough, once again, growing up when I did, I remember in the 60s and 70s where the cities, you know, really, really went through a very rough stretch. You know, we had the term white flight then, you know, was a big factor. There were worries about crime, public education in the cities, just, you know, a lot of things going on at that time. And I think once we started seeing revitalization of the cities, one urbanist I was reading wish I could remember his name right now. He talked about, he could tell things were starting to change when shows like The Brady Bunch and Leave It to Beaver and all that kind of stuff, all set in suburban types of things, were being replaced by shows like Seinfeld and Friends that were set in New York City. And you laugh at that. But, culture is an important thing. In fact, okay, here's where I'm going to stop a little bit and say, in this country, we like to think of ourselves as lone wolf, Gary Cooper type of people. We are individualistic Americans, and, we kind of like to think of ourselves a little bit as the lone gunfighter. Well, the truth is, rather than being more like wolves, we're more like sheep. And I'm sorry to say that, but we are very much, captive of what others are doing, and we take our cues from what others are doing. And so that, I don't think you can understate the importance of that. And I think that is really a key thing. So the cities were getting more revitalized, and the cities were where bicycling really has, I think you could argue, some of its greatest utility. As many of you know who bicycle around here, it's often as quick or quicker to get around by bike. It's a heck of a lot more fun, in my opinion. And the distances are relatively short. Many cities like Portland were blessed with the old streetcar network, the good grid system, which really, as the realtors say, provides good bones. So right from the start, you have more of ability to get around by bike. One of the problems in many suburban locations is a particular subdivision may be a pleasant place to bicycle in that subdivision, but you're forced to go out onto an arterial that, oftentimes was an old country road that's been upgraded, jammed with fast-moving traffic, and not a very pleasant place. And oftentimes really, is not a very direct route to where you want to go. The other thing that, interestingly, was happening during this period is that I think there was sort of a counter-reaction to the age of the automobile also. When I was young, a car was really almost freedom without any downside to it, or at least we perceived it that way. I could buy a used car for, I hate to tell you that, it's literally a couple $100s, and it would get you around. You could even work on cars back then. Just an average person could do it, and it really was a different kind of situation. I was watching Jon Stewart the other night, The Daily Show. If any of you watch that, and he had P.J. O'Rourke on, and I was prepared to grit my teeth. P.J. O'Rourke has something about cycling. He doesn't like these guys for some reason. If any of you are familiar with him, he's sort of a humorist, has been around for many years. But actually, he's written a new book sort of looking back fondly on the car culture of the 60s and the 70s. And I was prepared thought he would say, it was all the faults of all, these transportation reformers or whatever, booting Americans out of the car. But he really didn't say that. He really, I think, kind of nailed it and said, the romance of the car is gone because, we all had to we kept moving out, and pretty soon, you find you're out in your house, but you're 10 miles from everywhere, and this damn car's sitting in the driveway, and it's become an errand mobile. It's not the freedom machine, it's a mobile cup holder, and you got to spend your whole damn life in the thing. And that a lot of that just has kind of gone away. It's just not as much fun anymore. You don't have the muscle cars that you did have before, although I see plenty of people with pretty sleek, fast cars that are still on that. But, I think that if a guy like P.J. O'Rourke is talking that way, if any of you know them, I think that that really speaks to it some. And then, so that gets you to the interesting question of, okay, how does infrastructure and culture mix? So here, I actually have a couple of photos here. Let's see if I can do this. So this is Utrecht, the Netherlands, where no doubt you have, one of the best cycling cultures in the western part of the world. I mean, just sort of gawk at that photo for a while. This is near the train station there. And this is by no means all the bike parking. That's just one of the more central things. Okay? And then, so lots and lots of people on bikes, clearly. Integrating it with train travel, obviously. And then look at this. Here's, I don't know, what we would regard as middle school kind of kids, high school kids, riding home. I think this also was in Utrecht, if I remember. And they look like they're having a pretty good time. If you can see there, this is actually kind of a separated bikeway from the street. Maybe it doesn't show it as clearly as it ought to, but it is. So they can ride along pretty comfortably there. And so it sort of makes you kind of wonder, does culture create infrastructure or infrastructure create culture? I get asked that a lot. What sort of comes first, the chicken or the egg, so to speak? And I don't really have a good answer to it. I mean, I think it all sort of tends to feed off of each other. If you have a push for more facilities, then that comes from culture that encourages cycling to some degree, or at least some advocates who want that, and then that has kind of a feedback loop. In fact, I think the wonkish way to put it, and this is what I pick up from my day, my 30-some years as a political reporter, and that is that you see this in many types of issues. And I think this term was originally coined for the defense establishment in this country, and it's the iron triangle. Have any of you heard that phrase at all? Okay, good. A new generation that I can inculcate with that. The iron triangle, when it comes to military spending, is you have the Pentagon bureaucracy, the military essentially, and they want more. They want more weapons systems. They want more personnel. They want more weapons systems. They want more weapons systems. And, I mean, that's how you make careers in the military. You've got members of Congress who, oh no, I'm sorry, I'll go to the other part of the triangle. You've got defense contractors who want to sell weapons systems to the military. I mean, that's how they make money. And you have the people who control the purse strings, and that's Congress. Defense contractors support members of Congress. They bring projects to their district, campaign contributions, all kinds of other support that encourages the members of Congress to contribute more, or to provide more of the weapons systems that the Pentagon wants. People in the Pentagon says, gee, this is working pretty well. What else can we ask for? And it's just all a self-reinforcing, very powerful iron triangle. Many times through the years, people get in the way of that, and they find out what happens to them. As an aside, very interesting situation going on right now where Robert Gates, the defense secretary under Bush, now under Obama, wants to cancel several major weapons systems, and he's getting a real fight on that in Congress. I think where it makes sense, where the analogy works at the bike level, what I saw in many of the cities that I traveled to, particularly the more successful ones, although not universally, but what I tended to see was a little kind of mini iron triangle where you would have playing the role of the defense contractors. You'd have local advocates, citizens who are very interested in this, bike-related organizations that would be pushing, say, the city. You had people within the city bureaucracy that were supportive of this, and that was a very important thing. And then tying it all together, in the end, you had the elected officials that would push the bureaucracy, which would get more support from the public and develop a little thing of this. The only place where the analogy falls down is there really just isn't enough money in bicycling. Once again, the entire bike industry, if you took the entire economic value of the bike industry in America, it's about equivalent to the sock and hosiery industry, which last I saw was not really a power on Capitol Hill. And in fact, I have actually my solution to that whole problem of how you get some sort of economic juice into this whole bike movement, and that is that you require a prescription to ride and own a bike, which, when you think about it, makes a lot of sense, because if you regularly ride your bike and avoid getting in serious crashes, I could do a lot of studies that would show really a very efficacious effect on your body that really would be very comparable to, you know, what in fact, better than what a lot of drugs that are marketed, you know, better than the efficacy of many drugs that are on the market. And I think once you require a prescription, you get big pharma out there promoting this, you know, then folks, you're really going to see things happen. Of course, your bike's going to cost $10,000 or so, but that's no problem because you just put it on your health insurance. So it's no problem at all. And so kind of the last thing I wanted to do is, so, you know, we go from that picture, and I just had a couple shots that sort of intrigued me from New York. So here's New York City, and they've kind of taken this design from Europe. This is the West 9th Avenue cycle track. They have a new transportation commissioner in New York, Jeanette Sadek-Khan, who very supportive of bicycling and walking. Really, she sort of sees herself as the commissioner of public space. You know, she said this many times, that to her, roads are just part of this public space, and you need to figure out what's the best way to, you know, to use this public space. So they started experimenting with these cycle tracks. Here you are, right in the middle of Manhattan, where a lot of people said, you'd never bicycle there, you're crazy. I mean, if you go on this cycle track, you could take a 9-year-old on there and feel totally comfortable. Last time I was in New York, I was like, I thought it was so much fun. I was like in Disneyland. I kept circling around. You know, it's only about 9 blocks long. But as you can see, you know, it's on this pretty decent day, a little bit cold, but not a bad day in March, sunny. You know, I couldn't find big groups of cyclists using it. You know, yet they have shown upticks in ridership in New York, and that's the question. You know, someday are we going to see, you know, large numbers of riders there? This is on Broadway, where kind of the first step she did was on several blocks. If you go that way, you can just barely in the background see Times Square. Her first thing was to knock out, I think, was it 2 lanes? Yeah, I think 2 lanes of travel, and create these plazas here, and then a nice, you know, buffer bike lane. You can see how far away it is from the rest of the street. Since then, now the latest thing is they've closed several blocks of Broadway, so they've just decided, you know, this street kind of is an angled street through Manhattan, kind of messes up the street grid anyway. You have huge numbers of pedestrians in Times Square, and the most efficient use of this space are many of these blocks is just simply to close it off to traffic. And I'll tell you, boy, that all this stuff that she was doing that was really almost kind of under the radar screen, that cycle track I showed you on the last slide, I was sort of amazed how little attention it really got from the news media in New York on it. You know, it's amazing how people, you do something on the streets and they kind of, okay, you know, they get used to it. And Sadek-Khan is a master of doing quote-unquote temporary projects. See, all this stuff can be removed, so she didn't have to go through, you know, like go through the city council or anything like that. She just said, well, we're doing this kind of temporary thing as a test. And so she's a very savvy inside player. So we'll kind of watch and see how that develops and what kind of culture. And thanks for letting me ramble on, and I will be happy to take questions now.
And please remember to use the microphone.
Okay.
Is how I use it. Is it working?
Is the light on?
Yeah, but it doesn't stay on.
You have to keep pressing it.
Yeah, okay, I got it. You had the slides up of Utrecht and raised the question about which comes first, the culture or the infrastructure, I happen to be from Holland, and actually I was in Utrecht just last week.
Oh, wow.
One of my observations is that while there is definitely a bike culture, or maybe not even a culture, there is no bike movement.
Right.
There's just, bikes have been there everywhere forever. They were there before cars. The cities were built before cars. And there is no such thing as a bike culture. And actually, to me, as one from your generation, the U.S. bike culture, the young male spandex-clad bike
Right.
culture is totally alienating. I mean, I'm perfectly comfortable riding my bike all over Europe, but I'm not a biker,
You see,
I just ride my bike.
Could I disagree with you a little bit? You're right. I mean, it was sort of hilarious from the first research trip I took to the Netherlands, where I spent an afternoon wandering around Amsterdam just asking people about bicycling, and they kind of looked at me as if I was asking them how their toaster works, because it's really just a tool. But that's part of culture, I mean, it's so ubiquitous, it is kind of ignored. And there is a bicycle lobby there, I'm not an expert on Dutch politics, so I don't know how powerful they are. But culture isn't just weird stuff people are doing. Todd.
Todd Boulanger, to follow up on the previous comment, you're right. I mean, when I went to the Netherlands to seek help for bike parking, no one would return my calls because you don't ask how your toaster works. But there was a policy in the 50s and then the 60s and then 70s where people, the white report, they fought against the automobilization that was creeping in after the war, and they stopped it. So that was a decision that was made at a policy level and a community level. I mean, there were riots for building the subway in Amsterdam, and so they went through some wrenching public policy decisions a bit more successfully than in our community. Other than the Great Mount Hood decision. But I mean, nationally, it didn't happen to the same level here as it happened there.
We have a question from Sydney, Australia. Which is more effective, an active transport elected government like New York City providing infrastructure ahead of demand, or an activist critical mass type approach to getting more cyclists on the road than demanding infrastructure?
See, there's the chicken and egg question. And once again, critical mass, that phrase sort of sets me off a little bit. I'll explain in a moment. But I mean, I don't think there is a cut and dried answer to it, because I think in the end, to have a really ubiquitous bike culture like, say, you have in the Netherlands, I think you're going to need to have both of those things happening. I can't resist saying one thing about critical mass, and one thing I was struck with as I interviewed people is, depending on where you were, critical mass itself and that kind of confrontational, confrontational to the degree that they're out there taking taking over travel lanes in the middle of rush hour, on Friday evening in cities is by its nature confrontational. Really makes a difference depending on where you are. San Francisco, where it was founded, I think you could argue that it did play an important part in helping grow the bike movement there and in getting the city politically to start doing more for bike infrastructure. It's funny, at the time critical mass was formed, there was a guy, Dave Snyder, who was the head of the San Francisco Bike Coalition, and he was like Sinn Féin in Ireland. He'd say, these crazy critical mass guys that I ride with no, I didn't mean to say that. These crazy critical mass guys, they're never going to tell you what you can do. But here, I will tell you some sensible things that you can do as a city to, that will sort of, make those guys cool down a little bit and that kind of thing. So there it kind of worked. Just over in neighboring Marin County, for example, they tried doing a critical mass there, and it was very unsuccessful. People in Marin County, there's a little bit like Portland, although actually more upscale, but they're very involved, much into earnest community discussions and protests and that kind of thing. Do not fly there. Jen.
In your book, you talk a bit about the
debate between sort of the vehicular cyclist versus separate infrastructure. And I'm curious sort of where you see that now and in the future.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Does everybody sort of know about that debate? Should I? I'll just real quick. Vehicular cyclists. John Forrester was really the guy who coined that term, and really their argument is cyclists fare best when they act and are treated as much like a motor vehicle as possible. They don't think there should be at all separate facilities for bikes. Forrester doesn't like bike lanes, doesn't like bike boulevards, paths, any of that stuff. And of course, from his point of view, it's just fine that there's only a few cyclists out there. He wants well-trained cyclists, vehicular cyclists, and if there's 5 of them in the entire county, then that's fine. That's very good. My sense is in most cities, at least where kind of what I would call the modern urban bike movement has taken hold, I think they've gone sort of way beyond that. I'm struck in Portland, and I've been to dozens of hearings, community meetings, you name it, bicycle advisory committee, other seminars, and this thing rarely comes up. Now, I was asked to give a talk in Dayton, Ohio this summer, and they're doing kind of a bicycle and pedestrian summit, and I was talking to one of the guys who's coordinating the conference, and he says that now there are a lot of vehicular cyclists in his area. Dayton is very much a different place than Portland is. So I think, it still depends on where you are. But I think in many ways, certainly in the cities where I spend a lot of time in, I think they've kind of moved way past that debate. And it looks like Todd has a comment on that.
I think we may want to call them fundamentalist vehicular cyclists, because they've taken it to the absolute extreme, because a lot of us behave as vehicular cyclists on the road and paths.
That's an excellent point. Yeah.
Additionally, back to the question for New York City, remember there's over 150,000 bike commuters on Manhattan. So, that's a lot of people.
Yes.
One of the things I think we're seeing since the T21 or Ice-T in 1991 is that people are voting with their feet and with their wheels in favor of the projects that have been funded. The most popular project I've ever worked on is the Springwater Corridor Trail, but it's exceeded all of our wildest dreams in terms of usage and utility. My question is, though, is what you've seen around the country, and I've heard reports that are not so bright as that from other states. Particularly, I was talking to somebody who was involved with a citizens group in New Hampshire 2 years ago that was trying to get their state to develop a multimodal transportation plan and put money into projects like this, even though the federal laws require it. How well is that happening all over the country, or are there some states, departments of transportation, that are resisting this?
Oh, very much. There are DOTs around the country that are resisting this. One of the problems after the last transportation bill passed, and I told you about the money that Oberstar and others were able to get for cycling and pedestrian projects, one of the problems that they had was that many states were turning back a large share of the, because what happened was they started running out of money in the highway fund, so they were telling the states, okay, you got to cut your funding by X percentage, and that was often the first place that many states cut. I think I could be wrong on this. I think even Oregon returned some transportation enhancements money, that goes for these types of projects. But you're right that one thing, particularly trail projects, have proven to be very, very popular, and I think is an important part of what I would sort of generally call the bike lobby's success. There was back in, I think it was 2003, there was a very serious effort to knock all of that stuff out of federal transportation funding, money for bicycle and pedestrian projects. And Oberstar was very worried that he wouldn't have the votes to hold that off in the House. But the opponents of this kind of funding, they sort of made a tactical error. They did it right before a congressional recess. members went home, and the Rail to Trails Conservancy and other groups made sure that their members were just besieged with public comment saying how much they liked their local trails and those kind of projects. Came back, the attempt to delete this funding was defeated by huge numbers. Although, interestingly, I noticed the other day that the U.S. House Republican leadership came up with a budget proposal. They sort of took up Obama's challenge to find places to cut in the federal budget, and one of the things they want to cut is transportation enhancements. So it is still, it's still a live issue. Yes?
Can I have a follow-up on that?
Sure.
Any cases of follow-up cases of failed infrastructure projects, bike trails to nowhere, things that got built that didn't get used, unlike an anti-Springwater where it got built and got
that's an
tremendously
excellent
used.
question. None come to mind, although there are certainly examples of, like a couple of blocks of bike lane that have been striped in and nobody really uses. They are kind of trail or bike lanes to nowhere, and they don't get much use. I mean, not so much this one, but the one I just showed you back, that cycle track. I think they've had pretty decent ridership numbers on it, but you get here. Let's see if I can go back. That's not it. Well, forget it. I'm technically challenged. But you will find commentary in the New York press saying, here's the street and it's jammed with traffic, and the bike. Yeah. Now these are all parked cars, so you shouldn't take it from that. But you can kind of see out there. I mean, the street was pretty busy. I mean, it wasn't congested, I wouldn't say, but it was very busy. And as a cyclist,
There's only 2 people on the sidewalk, which doesn't look like New York either.
yeah. Well, it was. In fairness, it was a weekday afternoon, and about 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So not the real busy time, and it was kind of cold. I'd say in the 40s or something. So it was kind of chilly. But I mean, there have been complaints in the press about that. We gave up a lane of traffic for that. So there have been. Yes.
It seems like a problem with some of these is lack of connectivity. Like you have 8 blocks and it doesn't really start anywhere. It doesn't go anywhere. So I imagine trying to pull trails like that together, and I think ultimately what I imagine is, very pie in the sky, something like a bicycle interstate highway system. Can you ever imagine anything like that?
Well, it's interesting. The what is it? The Adventure Cycling Association, I think that's the name of it. They are actually developing an interstate bike network, and they hope to have it complete in I don't know how many years, but they're getting to there. Now, a lot of it is just sort of route markings, but there are a lot of things. For example, I believe now from something like Washington, D.C. to Pittsburgh, you can basically take a trail. Yeah, and so there are things like that. And connectivity, I mean, you're absolutely right, that is huge. The other day I was thinking about it in relationship to light rail. I mean, I've been in Portland long enough. I remember when light rail opened, with just that one line from Gresham to downtown. And, it was kind of nifty, but I didn't use it very much. But as the system gets more and more complete, I mean, each additional node on it, I mean, I'm sure you engineers out there have actually some formula that, figures out how much more useful a system gets as you get more nodes on it, and it has more connectivity to it. One of the things that I think Portland did that was really important in developing their bike network was that they did develop a network. I mean, they didn't just say, let's do 1 or 2 splashy projects, or let's really work hard on a bike-to-work day. I mean, they really tried to build a network that people could use to get around the city, in the same way that you want to use a car network. And I think that was a key point. They worked a lot on difficult connections. A lot of times it was, really this road is just fine, except, crossing this one street is really difficult. Let's see if we can work on that. Yeah.
Just to follow up, I did, on the way here, came off the Hawthorne Bridge and found myself right in the middle of, city traffic with cars and stuff. So I could imagine that being kind of daunting. But also, what was the name of the group that you said was working on a
Oh, I believe it's Adventure Cycling Association, if I got that right. Yeah, right there.
Was there something specific that prompted you to write this book, and what do you want people who read your book to come away thinking?
Good question. Yeah, actually what happened was, as I said, I've always loved riding my bike, but I have to confess, pretty much after my college years, it wasn't a huge part of my life for many years, although I did ride recreationally. But in the mid-'90s, I got a new bike. It was much more comfortable for me than my old 10-speed, and I started riding to work on nice days. It was about a 3-mile ride from where I then lived in the Irvington neighborhood. And coincidentally, it was about the same time that the city was really developing its bikeway network, striping in a lot of bike lanes, making improvements on the bridge. I used to remember coming over the Broadway Bridge, and when you got to the west end of the bridge, it was really, it could be kind of a little bit hairy. I remember the guys who were really cool, they would come flying down toward the intersection. They would hop off the curb, look over their left shoulder at the same time, and kind of make sure that they could zip across before a car went down to the right, down the Lovejoy ramp and smacked into them. I wasn't very good at that, but one day I was riding down there, and the city had fixed it all. They put in these bike signals there, and it wasn't a point where I got tensed up anymore. It just became an easy part of the ride, and that happened to me again and again. And I started thinking about, well, gee, who's doing this? Why are they doing it? What do they hope to accomplish? Is this happening in other cities? And I just sort of got interested in it. I think the thing that really gave me a kick in the butt, one night I was riding over the Hawthorne Bridge. It was like, by this time I'd become a year-round bike commuter. It was January or February, kind of raining and cold. I got down to the river, and it was sort of one of those cool Portland nights where the clouds rolled back and you could see the stars. And I rode up onto the Hawthorne Bridge, and it was feeling good, and the water roiling below was neat, and all of a sudden I saw this hawk or falcon or something swoop across the river, and I wanted to turn to somebody and say, wow, isn't that neat? But this was before, if I did that now, there would be somebody next to me, but at the time there wasn't. I happened to see this bus coming by, and it was all lit up, how buses are, and just jammed with people, and I'm looking at them going, oh, these poor people, stuck in this metal box on such a beautiful night out. And as I was looking at them, I realized they were staring back at me with looks of pity. and at that point, I thought, well, wait a minute. Why is there such a disconnect between how I'm feeling and how they think I'm feeling? And that I think, kind of said, okay, there's something to be done here. So.
Well, I think with that, we need to wrap up. I have one piece of housekeeping or two pieces of housekeeping for students enrolled in the course. You need to submit your final product as one document to either Professor Glebe or me by next Tuesday at 5 o'clock. So that's one document, and by email for me is fine. And next Friday, it is finals week, but we do have a seminar here. Professor Benjamin Koifman from Ohio State University will be speaking. And Jeff, I forgot to mention at the beginning, was featured in an article in the New York Times recently, which Jennifer brought a copy, but you can also find online. And finally, Jeff has some books available at the front of the room afterwards. So I encourage you to check out the book, and let's thank Jeff for his great presentation.
Thanks.